Rev up your engines! If you want to learn how to work on your car and do it right, there's a few things that are really a necessity to have. They don't cost that much money, and I'm going to show you what you need and how to use them so you can fix your own car, not spending a fortune, not wasting your money on either super expensive repairs or super expensive tools that you're hardly ever going to use. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is this AT205 reseal. It is a clear polymer. It looks like water. As you can see when I pour it in this dirty glass, it really looks just like water, but it isn't. It's a liquid polymer formulation. And what it does is it can stop leaks in rubber seals. The polymers rejuvenate the rubber. Now, I've been using this stuff for over 3 decades. Especially stuff's going to cost a fortune. Let's say you got a transmission front main seal leak that's leaking on the front of the transmission. Or you have an engine rear main seal leak where the transmission bolts into the engine. The seal on the back of the engine is the rear main seal of the engine, and the seal in the front of the transmission is the front main seal of the transmission. With age, those seals will leak. To replace either one of them, you have to, at a minimum, pull the transmission out of the car. You could pull the engine out, but it's usually easier to take the transmission off than the engine. Either way, it's a gigantic job. Being a polymer, this stuff works in engine oil, but also in transmission fluid. And what it does is it rejuvenates the rubber and it can stop leaking. I have used this hundreds of times. Guys who come with an automatic transmission. It's leaking at the front seal, dripping between the engine and the transmission, and it's dripping transmission fluid. I would put a bottle of this stuff in, pour it in the transmission. You would just pour it in there. To drive it, maybe 200 miles, doesn't matter right away or over time. I put it in a Volvo once. When you poured the transmission fluid in, you could see it dripping out as soon as you poured it in. One time I poured a bottle of this in. While I washed it, within 5 minutes, the drip actually stopped. And the same thing with rear main engine oil seals of the engine. Now with the transmission, if it seals it, great. It's in there, you just leave it alone. But if it's in the engine, then every time you change the engine oil, you'd have to put a bottle in. But I mean, really, if the bottle costs you 14 bucks, and you're saving over $1,000, who really cares? Stuff works great, like I said. I've been using it for over 3 decades. And the interesting thing is, being a polymer, it doesn't have any solids in it. There's a lot of sealers out there. You see them, you shake them up, you see all these solids. They can clog up your transmission and clog up your engine. This stuff doesn't clog anything up. So you can use it in any system that uses petroleum-based oils, you know? You can put it in engines, transmissions, rear ends, differentials. Now you can use it in power steering, but realize power steering pumps, they sometimes have 1,500 pounds per square inch pressure. Occasionally, this will actually rejuvenate seals and it can stop leaking. But there's so much more pressure. You got a lot less odds of it working in a 1,500 PSI system than you do in an automatic transmission where maybe it's pumping out 45 PSI versus 1,500. You can't expect miracles all the time. I used to have to search around for this stuff, but now I just go to Amazon, buy them at a case at a time. You can get it one at a time too if you want. I just buy it by the case, it's cheaper. Now let's say your radiator's leaking coolant, maybe a rock hit it, or maybe it's just old age. If unfortunately, let's say your head gasket is leaking. If your head gasket's leaking externally so that you see the coolant coming on the outside of the engine, this bar's leaks can work quite well because in a radiator system, you don't have that much pressure. It might be 12, 14, 16 pounds per square inch. That's not that much pressure. Now, if your head gasket is blowing inside the engine, you don't see it leaking externally, but it's burning it inside. You can try various sealers. Bar actually makes a head gasket sealer. It's worth trying. But then you've got the explosion of the engine, and again, you're dealing with thousands of PSI pressure when the gasoline ignites. And the odds of sealer sealing that much pressure is kind of slim. But since your radiator system itself, if it's leaking outside the engine and it's just the cooling jackets, it's only, like I say, 14, 16 PSI. This stuff can work quite well. I've used it for years. I put them in cars. Sometimes the radiator will last for 3 or 4 years before it starts leaking again. Sometimes they never start leaking again. And the advantage of this is, as you can see on the label here, works with water or antifreeze. And the real important part is this: used with all types of coolant, including yellow, orange, pink, red, blue, and green, silicate-based and non-silicate-based. oat, antifreeze, and or water. So you can use it in anything. Now, they do give you a logical warning on the bottle, which is totally true. If your cooling system is totally clogged up and filthy and rusty, you gotta flush it out first. You don't just pour this in an absolute clunky system. Since it works with water or coolant, you could flush it all out, just put water in, and then put this stuff in. See if it works. If it doesn't work, maybe you're gonna get rid of the car, maybe you're gonna replace the radiator, but you're not wasting the money of putting new coolant in, putting this in and finding out that you're gonna have to buy an expensive part. Just don't put it in a completely clogged up system. I've had people say, I tried that sealer, clogged up my car. No, if your car was clogged up in the first place, yeah, it can clog it up. And if it's the wrong kind of sealer, let's say it's a sealer made for the old green antifreeze, but you have red antifreeze, that can make the red antifreeze clog up. If you put it in a red antifreeze system when the sealer was only made for the green, and other sealers, they only work with water. It'll say flush everything out, only put water in, and then put this in. This can go with water, coolant, anything. It's permanent. You can leave it in. I've been using this stuff for decades. Basically what happens is you can see the silver parts. It's hot inside. And where it leaks out, it's being put out at a high pressure. And then it leaks out to our atmosphere that has oxygen. Well, this stuff, when it's hot and under pressure and it comes in contact with oxygen, it hardens and seals it up. Like I say, I've put them in some cars 3-4 years later, they're still driving them down the road. I mean, it's really a worthwhile thing to try if you've got something that maybe is an old clunky, you don't want to put much money in it, or let's say you're on a trip or something and a rock hits your radiator. Hey, maybe just buy a bottle of this, throw it in the trunk like I do. I got a can of it in the trunk of all my cars. You never know. I drive old cars, 15, 20, 30 years old. It's a handy thing to have. Now, the next handy thing I'm talking about comes in cans. It's called Plexus. It is a plastic cleaner, protectant, and polish. I've been using this thing for decades. I started on motorcycles. I found it at a motorcycle shop. Then the motorcycle shop went out of business. I couldn't find a place to buy it anymore. But of course, that was over a decade ago. Now, thanks to Amazon, you can get it in 2 seconds. I ordered it, came the next day. Stuff is amazing. It was originally invented for planes with those plexiglass stones to polish them and to keep them from being corroded. It has a light polish in it, but it's also got a protectant, and it's anti-static. So it actually keeps dust from being attracted. A lot of that dust is attracted to your car by static electricity. This neutralizes it, and it will actually stay cleaner longer. Now, it's good on any kind of plastic, but the main use, headlights. They're clear. You want them clean, but you don't want to scratch them up. And do as the directions say. Do not use paper towels. Use a nice microfiber towel. You don't want to scratch anything. You just spray it on and wipe it off. That's it. Now check it out. These are 5-year-old headlights. Look how they still shine. Now, I originally bought this matrix for my wife from a guy from Arizona. So it was in the Arizona sun. And the only thing that's really bad about Toyota and Lexus is a lot of their plastic headlight assemblies aren't that well made for ultraviolet protection, and they fade. So the original headlights faded. As you can tell, these aren't the stock factory ones. I got the darker ones that look cooler. I put these on 5 years ago, but 3 or 4 times a year, I spray them and polish them with this Plexus. They still look brand new. The ultraviolet protectant on this thing keeps them from fading away. Now, they claim that this not only cleans and polishes, but that it actually seals the micropores in the plastic to keep them from both fading and then eventually cracking. Well, who knows about that actual claim on the bottle, but 5 years later, they're still shining like new. And these weren't expensive headlight assemblies. These babies came from Taiwan. I got them on Amazon. They were $49 a piece. The cheapest ones I could find. Compared to the new ones I just put on my wife's Lexus. These were $249 a piece. And I had to replace them because on this, I had bought a cheaper replacement years ago, and they faded away like mad. They were painted with some kind of special paint. And the paint all chipped off and they looked like crap. I kept polishing and polishing. Finally, I gave up and bought these really expensive ones, which I now coat with Plexus, so I don't have to worry about. Now, that in itself is very good advice. If I would have known the idiots in China that sold me the original replacement ones had painted them with the clear lacquer, I wouldn't have bought them, because that's what happens to clear lacquer on headlights. It eventually cracks off. So if you watch any of these idiots on YouTube that put out videos that say, look, we get it all polished, we sand it down, polish it, and then we spray paint it with the lacquer paint so it seals it in. the stuff is gonna crack, fall off, look like crap after a year or two. I even asked my paint and body guy, I said, man, do you clean these up and repaint them? He says, we never paint them. It doesn't last. We will just replace them. If they want them polished, we'll polish them, but we'll tell them. We polished it. Well, it's an old plastic. It was polished. It's going to fade even faster now because it's thinner. These guys that say, oh, we'll spray paint them with clear lacquer. Unless you're selling the car right away, don't do it. Because the ones that I bought that were painted here, maybe a year and a half, the paint lacquer started to crack. Hey, this is on the top of the car. Sun hits it all the time, the heat of the engine. You want to protect it. That's why you want to get the Plexus once you buy it and protect it. Sometimes, hey, you really need to replace things in pairs or sets, but sometimes it's a complete waste of money. Now, in the case of brake pads, you do want to replace them in pairs. If your right front one's out, you want to change the right front and the left front brake pads. Anyways, that's how they sell them. You get a set. You get 4 of them. 2 for the right and 2 for the left. And you want to change them in pairs. Hey, my motorcycle only has 1 wheel on the front, so there's only 2 of them. There isn't a set of 4. And you want to change them in pairs because you want the car to brake evenly. And you don't want one side to be worn more than the other anyway. So if the front ones are gone, you replace both front ones. And if the back ones are gone, you replace both back ones. So it brakes evenly. You have the same material on each one, and it'll be safer. Realize that brake pads are made of all kinds of different materials. You don't want to have one type of material on one side and one on the other. Now let's say you have a bad brake caliper, the assembly that squeezes your brakes in. This can be a slightly different story. Over the years, a lot of places say, you got to replace them in pairs, spend all this money because they're a lot more expensive than brake pads. It's not going to work right, but realize that they won't naturally wear exactly the same. Take an instance that normally your right front tire hits more potholes than the left because you're sitting closer to the left wheel. You see a pothole, you're going to miss it, but if it's on a right wheel, you might not see it and you'll hit it. You can damage the right front caliper a lot faster than you can the left. So you might have a perfectly good left caliper, but the right one's bad. So let's say you jack the car up in here, you see the right front brake caliper is leaking, but the left one's perfectly clean. There's nothing wrong with just changing the right front caliper. Or conversely, say the right front caliper, when you jack it up, you try spinning the wheel and it's just locking up, but the left one spins freely. You could replace just the right one and then see what happens. Because if you do that and the brake's perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with doing that. How brake calipers work, they're pretty simple. Little rubber seals, a cup, usually made out of stainless steel. Sometimes they make them cheaper, but they used to make them out of stainless steel. And when you step on the brakes, the brake pressure pushes that cup, which then squeezes the brake pads. The only thing that really wears on them is if the seals go bad and they either lock up or the seals go so bad the fluid leaks out and you got to replace them. So if you got one that's working perfectly fine on the other side, you don't necessarily have to change them in pairs. Now, of course, you have to be logical with your decision too. Let's say you got a really old car, you live up north, and both of the calipers are rusted like mad. You might as well buy 2 rebuilt ones. And in this case, there's nothing wrong with buying rebuilt brake calipers. Basically all it is a piston inside a container, and when the pressure is pushed inside it when you step on the brake master cylinder, the fluid pushes that piston to squeeze the calipers. They're very simple devices, so there's nothing wrong with buying good remanufactured ones. They're a relatively simple device. It's not like you're rebuilding a computer with all these circuits. It's a pretty simple physical thing, so getting good rebuilt calipers, there's no problem with buying them. You don't necessarily have to buy new ones, which can sometimes cost 5 to 10 times as much as a rebuilt one. Struts. This is a McPherson strut. Do you need to change them in pairs, all 4? How can you change them? Now, they absorb shocks, part of the suspension system for handling and cornering or for a smooth ride. It's best to replace them in pairs. Each piston has gone up and down about the same amount of times. If one is worn out, the next one is probably soon to go out. A lot of guys, they're not going to use the factory struts because they charge too much money for them. So they won't use the dealer struts. They'll use aftermarket. And there's plenty good aftermarket ones out there. Generally, they're not going to be exactly the same configuration as the original equipment ones. So they're not going to ride exactly the same, corner exactly the same. So in this case, you need to change them in pairs. If the right front one's out, best to change the right and the left front. If the back one's worn out, best to change them in pairs. So it corners good, doesn't swerve around. Let's say you're driving an old junker. One strut is all worn out and all the hydraulic fluid inside is leaked all over it. It's covered in oil and that one side bounces like mad but the other side doesn't. You can just replace that one side and then drive it around. If it rides a whole bunch better and doesn't bounce, you're not wasting any money. If it still rides bad, you can change the other side. And a lot of guys with old junkers, if one side completely collapsed, they'll just change the one side and they'll say, heck, I'll just drive it and see how it goes. And then if they see the other side starts leaking like mad, then they'll replace that later. Headlight bulbs. Now I changed these in pairs because it's a new LED setup. Watch this. With a flip of the switch, now you have great warning lights. And of course, if you want to have headlights and warning lights, just put on the high beams and you'll have all kinds of warning systems going on. Now of course, if you're in a pinch at night, when your headlight burns out, quick go to a store, buy another bulb and put it in. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but here's something I've seen over the years that sometimes surprises people. But change the headlight bulb on one side and then a month or two later, the other side burned out. Is there something wrong with my car that's burning these bulbs out all the time? If you change one headlight bulb, and it's new, and the old one isn't, a little bit extra power that a new one takes can strain the old one, and it will quickly burn out. So, if you're the type of person that doesn't want to have your car messed with all the time, if one headlight burns out, change both bulbs. That makes the most sense. It's best to have both bulbs using the same amount of electricity, set up exactly the same, with the same brand bulb, so they work together correctly, rather than having an old one of one type, a new one of another type. You want to get two new ones that are exactly the same and install them at the same time. Then you won't have to think about it. Most cars, it's very easy to change the bulbs. A lot of auto parts stores that sell them, they'll install them free on most cars. You're best to do that, because if you put in one and the other one burns out and you think something's wrong with your car, and you go to a mechanic who's not totally honest, he's going to say, oh, I can tell him he's got an electrical short, and then charge him a bunch of money and just change the two bulbs and charge him labor for hours of stuff that I didn't even do. I have seen that happen to a lot of people. So if it's something simple, like a headlight bulb that you can easily do yourself, change them in pairs. Now if you own one of those fancy European cars that has those high intensity, some of the bulbs are like $160 up per bulb, you really have to change those in pairs. The way they run, if you change one, burn one out, I guarantee you in a few weeks or months the other side's going to burn out. You might as well as change them both at once, even though those are super expensive. You can go to any auto parts store and get a halogen bulb that's stock in a lot of cars for like $10. They don't cost anything. The HID bulbs, you really got to change those in pairs. And let's face it, if you bought a European car to save money, you bought the wrong car in the first place. Fuel injectors. Crucial to the heart of your engine. This one has 4 fuel injectors. They spray just the right amount of gas in your engine, controlled by a computer. Now, of course, as they wear, their flow properties start to change, but generally, they wear pretty evenly, all 4 at the same time. These babies have 239,000 miles on them. They're all original. Shows you Toyota makes some good stuff. But if a fuel injector ever went bad on this thing, if I wanted it to run correctly, I would replace all 4 injectors, because you can't have one brand new injector that has the perfect spray and 3 worn ones. It will not work correctly. And on really modern cars, you got to buy the right injectors, of course, but you even have to run a computer program to make the injectors work with the computer system and all the sensors on the car. It has to be run over with a computer to set them all up. You can't just pop the old ones out and pop new ones in and drive away. It will not run correctly. But if you got one of those real high-end cars, a V12 Audi. I watched the guy replace an injector once. It was like a 20-something hour job. It was insanity the way he worked on the car. And the stuff costs so much money. Guys will replace 1 or 2 if they're bad, and then they can use the computer to reprogram the whole system so that at least it'll run correctly. It'll be able to calibrate that injector to work the same as the other injectors. That's the advantage of buying a good car like a Toyota. Rarely do the injectors break. And if you got a 4-cylinder one, it's only got 4 injectors, so what the heck, replace them all in one fell swoop. And if you don't want to buy the expensive brand new injectors, what you want is to buy a set of calibrated injectors. So you make sure that the rebuilt injectors have been calibrated. There are places that rebuild them and do a decent job, but you got to buy a recalibrated set. Or if you had a really old car like this, heck, you could go to a junkyard and buy 4 of them off the same engine. They'd all be pretty much the same, you know? You could buy 4 of them off the engine. I mean, this has got 239 on it, and they're still working, so you could try used ones if you were in a gambling mood. Just get them off the same engine. Spark plugs inside here. Just like the fuel injectors, you really want to change all of them at the same time. You got 4-cylinder, you change all 4, matching set, so everything works perfectly. Because I've had customers in the past, they'll have a code like misfire cylinder number 3. They'll just change the number 3 spark plug. And then later they come back and say, well, now it's misfiring on cylinder number 2. You change all of them at once. Because if you change one and it's brand new, of course it's going to work the best. Then the other ones might not work quite as well, and they'll start misfiring on the other cylinder. Spark plugs don't cost that much money. Replace them in sets. Fan belts, or to be politically correct today, drive belts. If you got more than one, this one has 1, 2, 3 fan belts on it, and they have a lot of mileage on them, or they're a lot old and cracked, change the whole set of them. It only makes sense. If they're all old and worn out, any of them go at any time. So just change them all at one time. Then you don't have to think about it for years. Many modern cars only have one gigantic serpentine belt. So you can only change them all at once because there's only one. And in that respect, since you only have one fan belt that runs absolutely everything, and the cars are virtually undrivable if that belt breaks, look at it every once in a while. You see a bunch of cracks on it, change it now, and then you don't have to think about it for years and years and years. Or if it starts squealing first thing in the morning, realize that most modern cars, not only do they have one fan belt, but they have an automatic tensioner. You never have to adjust it, they adjust themselves. So, if you have one of those cars, and it squeals first thing in the morning, generally means you need a new belt. Replace the belt, because you don't want it breaking when you're driving on the road somewhere. And if they are squealing, it means they're worn. These modern belts are different than the old ones. The modern belts have all those grooves. And as strange as it sounds, as they wear, the grooves actually get deeper. Then they don't ride on the spools very well. Like your alternator's got a bunch of grooves in it, and the belt fits in there. And as it wears, the holes in the belt get deeper, and then it doesn't sit right. It doesn't sit perfectly. It sits only on the edge of the belt, and that's why the belt makes noise, and that's why you'd want to change the belt when it's making noise. It's telling you it's worn. It's actually giving you a warning ahead of time. Now my RAV4 customer has a problem. It's an older car, it's 10 years old, has 180-something thousand miles on it, so it's got wear. And the problem that they're complaining about is, at higher speeds, when they brake, they feel like the car is losing control. So if you have a problem where you feel you're losing control when you're braking, first, of course, check the brake system. You gotta start logically. The brake fluid is full, and when I look under the vehicle and check all the wheels, the front, and walk around and check the back ones inside and out, I don't see any leaks. Well, I figured it probably isn't leaking because the brake fluid is full, but you never know, could be starting to leak. But they're bone dry, so they're not leaking. And I'll pull off the right front wheel to see what the brake pads look like. Pull off the hubcap. Yeah, this thing still has a hubcap. Dinosaur technology here. Off it goes. Double check the brake pads. We can see in here, they're still plenty of thick. They're really thick. There's plenty of brake pads. Nothing's particularly worn. This is just surface rust. Steel's always going to rust, so there's really nothing wrong with the braking system. There's no leaking fluid or anything anywhere. And when I pull on the whole assembly, it doesn't wobble back and forth, so the tie rod's good, and up and down it doesn't wobble, so the ball joint's good. Now, this is an old car, and it's got the original struts on it. This is just a dust cover. It's ripped, but the strut itself, it's dry. It's not leaking. Now here's where most dishonest mechanics are going to take you for a ride. They'll say, oh, you got 180,000 miles, your struts are worn out. Now, I'm sure they're worn. It's got 180,000 miles on them. But I took it for a spin. It rode good. When you hit bumps, it didn't particularly bounce around too much. The only problem it really has is at higher speeds, when you brake, doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel stable. Now, of course, with the jack up in the air, we'll pull on this side too, but it doesn't have any play either, really. And again, the strut, as you can see in here, the rubber dust cover's ripped again, but the strut itself, it's dry. It's not leaking. But as I said, a lot of mechanics, they see a car's 10 years old, 180,000 miles, they're gonna sell a set of very expensive struts to the customer saying, oh, that's why the struts are worn out. But in this case, that is not what's happening. Now, sometimes if the back struts are worn, that'll make it handle weird when you brake at high speeds, but hey, we push on it, it doesn't particularly bounce, it doesn't have bad rebound on either side when you push it. See, it's still pretty stiff for a car that's got 180 something thousand miles on it. When you start it up and look, it doesn't have any particular warning lights on. The only warning light was the airbag, which is checking itself and turned off. So there's no kind of warning with the brake system. Well, then what could be possibly wrong at this thing? Feels like it's kind of losing a bit of control when you brake at high speeds. Well, understand this. When you brake your car, where is the braking occurring? The brakes squeeze the rotors, but what's actually stopping the car? If you got tires, you're right. Tire treads hitting the ground, that's what's stopping your car. And if you have any type of problem, especially with the front tires being worn, maybe being out around, when you brake at higher speeds, you're gonna feel that. Now, of course, check the tire pressure on all four tires. Something as dumb as differential tire pressure can cause all kinds of squirrely stuff when you brake hard. But in this case, all four tires were pretty close to 32.5 PSI. So it's not the tire pressure in this case. So let's check the tires. Let's take a close look. Well, when we look at the back ones, we see these are really pretty new tires. See, they still got these little nubs from the molds. They got a lot of tread, and they're in excellent shape in the back. On the left, and again on the right rear. See, you can see the little molding nubs, they're still sticking out. But let's go to the front. Here's the right front tire. You can see half of those nubs are worn off, and even though it's got tread, they're not in as good shape as the back ones were. And when we go to the driver's front tire, we see the same thing. You can see here, there's one little nub here, but the other ones are broken off. This tire has more wear than the back ones do. Which isn't surprising on any modern car. Most cars are front wheel drive. The front tires drive the car. They wear out more because they're pulling stuff. They also do over 90% of the braking. And when you corner, they're leading into the corners. So if you got tires that are weaker in the front, a lot of times you're going to feel that when you do harder braking. Now, I've had this personal argument for years with the supposed tire experts, and they say in modern cars put the best tires on the back. Well, that's a load of baloney. Now, of course, you want 4 good tires. That's common sense. You don't want to be driving on bad tires. But when you look at this car, as I took the right front tire off to check the brakes, you can see it's still got tons of tread. It's not like they're horrible tires, but the back ones are indeed newer and in better shape. So there's nothing wrong in putting these still decent tires in the front on the back and putting the ones that look brand new from the back to the front. Because let's face it, you brake more on the front tires. The front tires wear out faster than the back tires. They also have to have the best traction for taking off without the tires slipping. I had an argument years ago with my Matrix there. It would slip when you took off fast, especially if it was a little bit wet outside. And it had really old tires that were 7 years old on it. But I thought, well, I'll change just the front ones so they'll have better grip and they won't slip and they'll ride better, right? So I go to the tire place and say, I want 2 new tires on this in the front. And following the stupidity of many companies these days, they didn't listen to a word I said, and they sold me 2 new tires, but they put them on the back. I got in a car, I said, I want them in the front, I don't want them in the back. And they said, no, we put the good tires on the back and the other ones on the front. That's our policy. I said, well, your policy is nonsense. Brought it home. Now I don't have a tire machine, so I can't take tires off rims and change them. I just took the new tires they put on the back, put them in the front, and put the old front ones in the back. Now, yeah, maybe I should have bought all 4 new tires, but the other tires still had about 80% of their tread left on it because we don't drive that much. 2,000-3,000 miles a year, so they had plenty of tread left, but I didn't like them slip. So with these brand new tires on the front of the Matrix, guess what? It didn't slip anymore when I accelerated hard. Whether it was rain, whether it was uneven pavement, it stopped the slipping by putting the good tires on the front and not the back. And in the case of this RAV4, I mean, these old front tires, they still do have a ton of tread on it, just like my Matrix did. So I'm gonna put the front ones in the back and the back ones in the front. So put the front down on a jack stand, jack the back up in the air, and take off the tire. And we'll pull off the hubcap again, and swap the tires. Roll it out of the way, and get the new tire. These electric impact wrenches are good for taking tires on and off. They don't get them too tight. And here comes a wayward tire. I will jack it back up in the front and do the other side. Take the hubcap off. Then we jack up the other side in the back, and we'll swap these tires. And here comes the one that used to be in the front, now it's going in the back. You notice these are different hubcaps. These are the original ones with the Toyota emblem on them. The other ones are aftermarket, but you can only see one side of the car at a time, so who cares? Then the tire that was on the rear is going on the front. Then we reach under and get the jack stand out, then let it down and take it for a ride. Away we go. And now when we brake at higher speeds, guess what? It just stops nice and straight. The only problem here is the noise you hear because I stopped so fast that it activated the anti-lock brakes because it's cold and slippery this morning. That has nothing to do with the problem. That's just the ABS kicking in. If I stop a little slower here, you'll see you don't hear any of the noises. That was just the ABS activating. You get an old car like this, yeah, they're gonna make noise. Even my wife's Lexus. If you slam on it real hard, the ABS will make weird noises as it's activating. So now you've seen how sometimes something as simple as moving your tires from the front to the back and the back to the front can solve a problem that you've had. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.